Please join me in welcoming our champion, a dear friend of this organization, the senator from the great state of New Jersey, Cory Booker! There he is.
It's just a matter of time before we gonna try out. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Sit down, for crying out loud. Thank you. I cannot tell you how psyched I am. First of all, for crying out loud, I watch this presidential elections and I see everybody with like 5, 10, 15 flags behind them. As a senator, I wanted to have one at least, okay? And I wanted to remind people that this is what we do every day, and we take these words for granted. We pledge an oath. We pledge allegiance to these ideals, not to a piece of fabric, but to what it stands for. Liberty and justice for all. Now I tell you this, I get to speak to a lot of groups, but today I am so excited to be right here, right now, speaking to you, because folks often in life surrender to cynicism about our country. I think cynicism is a refuge for cowards. We are here because of people who rejected hopelessness, rejected cynicism. In the face of wretchedness, in the face of hate and bigotry, they kept believing that this flag and the words of our founding mean something. We are here today because you all are not folks who allow their inability to do everything to undermine your determination to do something. We are here today because you all are not the folks who are getting caught up in what I call a state of sedentary agitation. When they're so upset about what they're seeing in our nation, but they don't realize that change has never come from folks who wait for it. It comes from folks who demand for it, who work for it, who sweat for it, and struggle for it. So look, I had a father who raised me in a suburban town in northern New Jersey. Before I even had full consciousness, I was a baby, just months old. They had to fight a big battle to be the first black family to integrate this neighborhood, as my father called us, the 4 raisins in a tub of vanilla ice cream. And I grew up in this abundance and this relative privilege compared to my dad, who grew up poor. And he would say, son, I was so poor I couldn't afford to be poor. I was just po, P-O. I couldn't afford the other 2 letters. And so just imagine my father, who is walking around looking at me, just enjoying the abundance that I had inherited from my ancestors and from other Americans, enjoying a life that he never even imagined or dreamed of was possible. My father used to look at me walking around and seeing me, and he'd say, boy, don't you dare walk around this house like you hit a triple. You were born on third base. Your generation drinks deeply from wells of freedom, liberty, and opportunity you did not dig. You eat lavishly from banquet tables prepared for you by your ancestors. Don't just sit back and dumb, fat, and happy consuming all of these blessings. They have to be used and metabolized in your body to energize you, because the fight for this country continues, my father would say. Now, my father had a way of telling stories. Most of them I doubt the veracity of. But he tells this one story about sitting in the back of a classroom. Teacher comes into class, first day of school, and she goes, class, I want to teach y'all about self-esteem. And she goes, now, I want to know right now, anybody in this classroom thinks you're dumb, thinks you're stupid, I want you to stand up. And my father says he looked around, nobody was moving, and the teacher was standing there impatiently. She, come on now, you think you're dumb, you think you're stupid, stand up right now. And my father said he looked around, nobody was moving, so he finally stood up proudly. And the teacher stood there and looked at him and says, boy, Mr. Booker, boy, what's wrong with you? You think you're dumb? You think you're stupid? And my father said he just scratched his head and said, well, shucks, ma'am, I don't think I'm stupid, but I didn't want you to be the only one standing. When Chad told me about this group that was here today, these are the folks that I want to be with. A lot of people say this saying from Washington about change, that it never comes from Washington, it must come to Washington. Change came to Washington in the suffrage movement and the abolitionist movement. Change came to Washington in the labor movement. Change came to Washington in the civil rights movement. In some of the most dramatic chapters from our collective history, we have advanced as a nation because in the grassroots, people did not accept our nation as it was, but determined and daring and courageous. They saw our country as it could be and didn't wait for it, but made it happen. And so this group right here of organizers and activists, of believers, this group of lovers, you all, to me, are showing the deepest patriotism, and I use that word love for a reason. I do not accept this aspiration that we should be a country of tolerance. Tolerance just says I'm stomaching your right to be different. If you disappear off the face of the earth, I'm no better or worse off because I was just tolerating you. But love is what our nation should be about. Patriotism is love of country. You cannot love your country unless you love your countrymen and your countrywomen. And I believe that love, what love calls for, is a recognition that we each have worth and we each have value, we each have dignity. It recognizes that I need you and you need me. We don't have to like each other. We don't always have to agree with one another, but there is a basic core understanding that we need each other. That, as the old African saying says, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. This is a country with a natural and deep interdependency. I know we talk about rugged individualism and self-reliance, but rugged individualism did not get us to the moon. It did not map the human genome. Didn't pave our roads and bridges. We can't win as a nation if we're leaving people on the sidelines, if we're denying them dignity, if we're denying them worth, if we're denying them equal rights. And so I'm here today to tell you that we have work to do. I was celebrating. I was in tears when the Supreme Court decision came down and great heroes like Obergefell just helped to usher in a new era of marriage equality. But I was not fooled on that day. We won a victory, but it was a battle. There was still a fight left to go. When we have a nation where some people can't even stand up and tell the truth about who they are without fear of violence and intimidation, we have work to do. If just in the last year, in 32 states, there's been over 200 pieces, almost 200 pieces of legislation trying to deny people the basic rights, liberties, and justices that this country must guarantee to everyone, or it should not be, in my opinion, it should never be secure with anyone. We have work to do in this country now. When you see in states across this country, like Missouri and Tennessee, blatant efforts to strip people of rights. What we just watched in South Dakota as valiant Democrats tried to filibuster to stop the stop the discrimination being written into the Constitution of that state, denying the freedoms and equality and protections to transgender Americans. Understand how I feel when we have a nation right now that this issue goes deeper to the fundamental truth of who we are, and we're seeing the ugliness and the bigotry that was manifested in generations past be made manifest now too. Look, I fight for criminal justice reform. It's one of the issues that I push for every day down in Washington. And to see what it does to the most vulnerable in our population, the poor, the minority, the mentally ill. It's a system that is so profoundly unjust, costing us trillions of dollars. The land of the free, with only 5% of the globe's population, 1 out of every 4 incarcerated people on the planet Earth are here. But I see this affecting every community. If you're a trans woman, you have a 21% chance of being incarcerated way disproportionate. Trans men, 10% chance. I see the ugliness of our unfinished business all across our country. I tell you this, my parents, my father who raised me, my mom and dad, they raised me to understand that the cause for justice and freedom has no color. The King and John Lewis, Ella Baker, that these folks were not fighting for black justice, they were fighting for the ideals and the principles of justice. And as was said by Martin Luther King about our interwoven destiny, that we are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a common garment of destiny, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so I look here at this group, this room that understands the work we have to do, but let me make it even more painful. This is a pointed reality that to me is so frustrating because we've seen it before. We've seen it in the lynchings of our past. We started at the riots at Stonewall. We've seen it with Emmett Till and Matthew Shepard. We live in a nation with horrific violence still targeting people based simply on who they are. Last year, 2015, we had the murder, vicious bigotry, hatred manifested in murder of 21 transgender people in our country. I tell you, I want the gospel of love to be our motivation, that we should be like those before us who, in the midst of bigotry and hatred, they knew the choice, the decision, how you manifest your power, that you always have that choice. That you can either accept things as they are or take responsibility for changing them. People, generation after generation, who in the midst of hatred, they stood up for love. In the midst of darkness, they unleashed their light. In the midst of the worst of conditions, they showed the best of humanity in continuing that long march to freedom. We are bounded together in a cause greater than us. It is offensive to me as an American that the most basic rights of citizenship are still denied to people, to my brothers and my sisters. It is offensive. It should motivate. It should inspire. It should demand from us. All those people who boarded buses knowing they would be bombed, protested knowing that they would be beaten, all of those people who we inherited this country for, who we can never pay back, we must pay forward. And we pay it forward by our conviction that here in America, we cannot have a nation where the majority of our states, you may now be able to get married, but in those states, the next day after your wedding, when you post your pictures up on Instagram, Facebook, and yes, chat, Snapchat, that the next day you could be homeless because you're kicked out of your housing, or jobless because you've been denied your job based on who you are. And so I want you all to know that this is the cause of the moment. We are bound together. The balance of our nation is not in the hands of a people in Washington. I reject the great man history of our country, the great man theory of history, that somehow these great people descended from Mount Olympus, the Kings and the Kennedys, the Lincolns and the Washingtons, and delivered us to freedom. That has never been the way. My father made it clear to me as a child that I am the result of a grand conspiracy of love, of ordinary Americans who did extraordinary things for the cause of freedom. But I want to put a warning sign right now. I want to warn you that those who settle for tolerance have a lot of an easier road. Those who just think, hey, let me build walls around me, let me turn my face from the injustices, let me just make sure me and my family are okay. Hey, the tolerance path is an easier road to hoe. But that road, I'm telling you right now, is not fruitful. It doesn't produce the abundance. It does not produce the light. It does not produce the results that I believe have been the intentionality of the spirit of this nation for so long. This country now demands lovers, and the warning I give you is that for lovers, it is hard. It is painful. It is dangerous. You will have your heart broken. When I was working as an activist in Newark, I witnessed horrific conditions. We saw challenges not just for poor kids, but for poor gay kids. We saw challenges for kids that were caught up in the criminal justice system. We saw kids that were victims of violence. And I tell you, there was a day that I witnessed violence like I had never witnessed it before. My heart was broken. I went home literally with blood on my hands from my vain attempts to save a child's life. And I'll never forget the darkness I descended into and the hurt and the pain. And I gave in to the basest of my emotions. I had rage and anger. I felt betrayed and stung by those words that we pledge, liberty and justice for all. I felt like giving up. I was angry. And I'll never forget the next morning when I woke up. I came downstairs into the courtyard of my projects I was living in. I was walking through the lobby into the courtyards, and I remembered in that lobby another boy had been murdered. It was the son of the tenant president of my buildings. And these were tough buildings. These were tough projects with challenges. And as I walked through, I thought about that tenant leader, this elderly woman whose child was murdered in those buildings back in 1980, and yet she never left. I knew where she worked. I knew the money that she made. I knew she could have moved just out of the neighborhood. She could have moved out of Newark and gone away, and her pain would have seemed like a justification of a retreat. But she showed that love does not give up. She showed that hope does not exist in the abstract. Hope is letting the world know that despair will never have the last word. As I walked through that lobby, remembering her, feeling like I was 100 feet underwater, I came in. No one else was there in that early morning except for the tenant president, Miss Jones. Her back was turned towards me, and I'll never forget what she did. I stood there still wrestling with my demons of despair and anger and bitterness and rage, feeling like I wanted to give up. And as I'm wrestling, she turns her back around, and she now is looking at me. And I'll never forget that what she did. There were no words at that point for me. She did what I needed her to do. This elderly woman, maybe 5 foot and a smidgen tall, I'm 6'3", all she did was open her arms. And I was like a little boy again, and I scurried towards her, and I hugged this woman. And then I began to cry. I cried my rage, I cried my anger, I cried my disappointment in our country. But she held me and then repeated to me over and over again 2 words, over and over again. And these are the 2 words I want to say to you, and I'm telling you, I would go on to be the mayor of that city, and on down days, on tough days, on frustrating days, I would repeat these words. They have nothing to do with religion, but when my state refused equality in marriage, I would repeat these words over and over again, never giving up, never giving in. When I came down to Washington, and some days feel like I'm banging my head on an implacable wall where I can't even get one Republican to sign on to a piece of legislation justifying and affirming the rights and equality of everybody, I say these 2 words. And I want to say them to you now because I want to be honest. We have a hill to climb, and it is going to be hard. We're going to be taken on fire as we charge this hill. It's going to be steep. There'll be times that we stumble. There'll be times that we fall. There'll be times that we lose battles. And there'll be times, unfortunately, where we lose our brothers and sisters to hatred and bigotry. But we must recall these words. As I stood there with this woman, as she held me, as I sobbed, she rubbed my back and said over and over again 2 words. She said, "Cory, stay faithful. Stay faithful." stay faithful. Our founding documents were saturated with bigotry. They referred to Native Americans as savages. They didn't refer to women as if they didn't exist. They referred to blacks. Stokely Carmichael used to always say constitute, constitute. I can only say 3/5 of the word. But read those documents. We're the oldest constitutional democracy on the planet Earth. Read those documents. They were not about us being a country because we all look alike, because we all pray the same, because we all speak the same language, because we all love the same. These documents spoke to ideals of freedom and equality and justice that have motivated every generation, and it's our turn now. Will we stay faithful? Read those documents. It says at the end, for this country to be true, for this country to advance, it says we must pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. That call to our interdependency and to our commitment is as true then as it is now. We must stay faithful and know that this country came together with the understanding that we must work to form a more perfect union. Even at the times of our most savage divisions in a country being torn apart by civil war, it was our president that called upon us to be lovers of each other, with malice towards none, with charity towards all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. We must strive forth and continue the work that has been begun. We are the next generation of freedom fighters. We are the next generations of lovers. We are the next generation that has a choice to allow inequity, injustice, bigotry, and hate to fester, or will we advance to the higher ground of freedom, of equality, and love? Will we stay faithful in this cause? That is our calling. That is our challenge. And when history calls, there is no choice. There is no choice. There's one answer that everyone doesn't give, but we don't need everybody. We need a faithful few to join together that knows that the dream of this nation still demands. This country still calls to our conviction and our courage. When this nation calls us, we must stand true and pledge not with words or with salutes, but with our actions and our deeds, that we will be a nation of liberty and justice for all, that we will stay true to the cause, that we will stay loyal to our ideals, and that we will stay faithful to America. God bless you all. Thank you.